Before we even speak about armies crossing seas, before we mention names like Tariq ibn Ziyad, we have to pause and ask a deeper question. What was happening inside Spain itself? Because history is never one-dimensional. Empires do not collapse merely because an external force knocks on the door. They collapse because the foundations were already cracked. At the time, Iberia was ruled by the Visigothic kingdom a Christian monarchy that had inherited Roman structures but struggled to maintain unity. On the surface, it appeared powerful. It had territory, an army, a ruling elite. But beneath that surface, there was political instability, factionalism, and resentment simmering among different groups within society. The Visigothic system was deeply aristocratic. Power was concentrated among nobles who often competed with one another. Kingship was not always stable or hereditary in a smooth way. After the death of King Witiza, disputes over succession intensified. Roderick's rise to power was not universally accepted. Some factions supported him, others opposed him. And when leadership becomes contested, when legitimacy is questioned, the state weakens from within long before any external threat appears. Psychologically, a divided leadership creates something dangerous: distrust. When elites are fighting each other, the population begins to lose confidence. Loyalty becomes fragmented, and when loyalty is fragmented, defense becomes fragile. We also cannot ignore the social tensions. Certain communities, particularly segments of the Jewish population, and even some local Christian groups, felt marginalized under Visigothic rule. Historical records indicate religious restrictions and political pressures that bred dissatisfaction. When segments of society feel oppressed or excluded, they may not defend a system with conviction. They may even view change as relief. This is a universal lesson. No society can sustain strength if large portions of its population feel alienated. Stability is not merely about military might. It is about perceived justice. It is about fairness. It is about whether people believe the system represents them. Now contrast this internal fragmentation with what was happening across the Strait of Gibraltar. In North Africa, under the Umayyad administration, there was expanding unity and purpose. While Spain struggled with internal disputes, Muslim forces were operating with centralized command and clear direction. When one side is fractured and the other side is cohesive, the outcome becomes predictable. But let us go deeper than politics. There is a philosophical dimension here. Civilizations decline morally before they decline militarily. When corruption becomes normalized, when leaders prioritize personal ambition over collective welfare, when internal rivalries outweigh national security, decline becomes inevitable. The fall of the Visigothic political order was not an overnight collapse. It was the culmination of years of instability. And when Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed into Iberia in 711 CE, he was not striking a fortress at its peak strength. He was entering a system already weakened by distrust, injustice, and internal competition. This is why the Muslim advance was so rapid. Within a few years, much of Iberia was under new administration, not because numbers alone guaranteed victory, but because resistance lacked cohesion. The Battle of Guadalete was decisive, yes, but it was decisive because the structure behind Roderick was already unstable. And here is where the lesson becomes personal. We often focus on external threats in our own lives. We blame outside forces, competition, enemies, circumstances. But the real question is, what is happening inside? Are we united internally? Are our values aligned? Is there integrity and leadership, whether in a nation, a community, or even within ourselves? Because if there is internal chaos, the smallest external pressure can bring collapse. The story of Spain before the conquest is not merely about a kingdom that fell. It is a mirror. It forces us to confront a timeless reality. Strength begins from within, and decline also begins from within. If you want to protect what you have, your faith, your family, your community, do not start by looking outward. Start by repairing the cracks inside. History whispers a warning to every generation. No empire is conquered from the outside until it has already surrendered from the inside. Now, once we understand the internal weakness of the ** Visigothic kingdom **, we can appreciate the magnitude of what happened next. Because history does not just move through systems, it moves through individuals. And in 711 CE, one individual stepped into that moment with extraordinary conviction. Tariq ibn Ziyad **. Tariq was not a king, he was not from an ancient royal lineage, he was a Berber commander serving under the Umayyad governor of North Africa. Yet sometimes history chooses the unlikely. Sometimes leadership is not about pedigree, it is about readiness. When Tariq crossed the narrow strait separating North Africa from Iberia, he did so with approximately 7,000 men. Think about that number. 7,000 soldiers entering unfamiliar territory, facing a kingdom that, on paper, had far greater resources. This was not reckless ambition, it was calculated courage. That crossing itself is symbolic. The body of water we now call the Strait of Gibraltar takes its name from Jabal Tariq. The mountain of Tariq, referring to the rock where he landed, today known as *** Gibraltar ***. Even geography preserves the memory of conviction. A mountain carries his name because he dared to step where others hesitated. But let's move beyond the romance of the story and examine the psychology. What drives a leader to take such a step? It is not blind optimism, it is clarity of purpose. Tariq understood the political fractures in Spain. He knew this was not an impenetrable empire, but more importantly, he possessed internal certainty. And that certainty becomes contagious. There is a famous narration attributed to him in which he addresses his soldiers, reminding them that the sea was behind them and the enemy ahead. Whether every detail of that speech is historically verified is less important than what it represents: total commitment. The psychological power of removing the option of retreat. When a leader communicates that there is no turning back, he transforms fear into focus. Great leadership is not about eliminating fear, it is about directing it. Tariq's army was composed largely of Berbers who had recently embraced Islam. They were not a long-established imperial force, yet under disciplined command they became a cohesive unit. Why? Because leadership provides structure to courage. Tariq also demonstrated tactical intelligence. He did not rush blindly into confrontation. He gathered intelligence, moved strategically, and engaged when the conditions favored him. When he eventually faced King Roderick at the Battle of Guadalete, he exploited divisions within the Visigoth ranks. Leadership is not merely about bravery, it is about timing. And here is something profound. Tariq's strength was not simply military. It was moral confidence. His campaign was not framed as plunder, but as expansion under a system that believed itself to be just and divinely guided. Whether one analyzes this theologically or historically, belief in moral legitimacy gives armies resilience. When soldiers believe their cause has meaning, endurance multiplies. But do not misunderstand this as mythology. Tariq was human. He operated within political realities. He answered to higher authority, specifically to Musa ibn Nusayr. Yet within his scope, he exercised initiative. He did not wait for perfect circumstances. He acted when opportunity aligned with preparation. And this is where the lesson becomes relevant beyond the 7th century. Moments of transformation rarely announce themselves clearly. They appear risky, they seem disproportionate to your resources. You look at your 7,000 and you compare them to the empire before you and hesitation creeps in. But history consistently shows that conviction, clarity, and unity can outweigh numbers. Internal discipline can overcome external size. A focused minority can reshape a distracted majority. Tariq ibn Ziyad did not conquer Spain alone, but without his decisive step, the entire sequence of events might have unfolded differently. Leadership often means being the first to cross the water. It means stepping onto unknown ground and anchoring your resolve so deeply that even the mountain remembers your name. And here is the reflection we must sit with. Opportunities do not wait for the perfectly prepared, they reward the courageous and principled. If you are waiting for certainty before you act, you may wait forever. But if you cultivate conviction, strategy, and integrity, then when your Gibraltar appears in front of you, you will not hesitate to cross. When Tariq ibn Ziyad set foot in Iberia, the crossing itself was bold, but boldness alone does not change history. Every movement eventually reaches a moment of confrontation, a decisive test that determines whether ambition becomes legacy or merely a footnote. For this campaign, that moment arrived at what historians call the *** Battle of Guadalete***. This was not just a military encounter, it was a collision of systems. On one side stood King Roderick, representing the established authority of the *** Visigothic kingdom, ***. On the other side stood a smaller, highly motivated force under Tariq. Numerically, the Visigoths were superior. They had local familiarity, larger manpower, and the psychological advantage of defending their homeland. Yet, numbers on paper do not fight battles, cohesion does. One of the most critical factors at Guadalete was internal division. The Visigothic nobility was not united behind Roderick. Some factions had grievances, some may have even withheld full support. When leadership lacks unanimous loyalty, the army reflects that uncertainty. Soldiers sense hesitation. And hesitation in battle spreads like a fracture through glass. Contrast that with Tariq's forces. They were far from home, which in one sense made them vulnerable. But it also made them unified. There was no internal competition for the throne among them. There were no rival aristocrats calculating political gain. Their objective was singular. That unity becomes psychologically powerful. When everyone in a formation believes retreat is not an option and success is shared, discipline strengthens. The battle itself, fought near the Guadalete River in southern Iberia in 711 CE, reportedly lasted several days. It was not a sudden skirmish but a sustained engagement. And during those days, something deeper than swordplay unfolded. Leadership was tested, morale was tested, trust was tested. Roderick's defeat was not merely tactical. It symbolized the collapse of centralized resistance. Once a king falls in such a decisive confrontation, the psychological impact is enormous. Armies without a stable command structure often dissolve rapidly. Cities that might have resisted instead negotiate. The momentum shifts, and momentum in history is sometimes more decisive than manpower. But here is where we need to pause and reflect more deeply. Why do some moments become turning points while others fade? Because certain events crystallize existing weaknesses. Guadalete did not create Visigothic instability, it exposed it. It did not manufacture division, it revealed it under pressure. Pressure is a revealer. When a system is strong internally, pressure refines it. When a system is weak internally, pressure breaks it. The battle was the pressure point. And under that pressure, the fractures within the Visigothic order widened beyond repair. For Tariq and his army, victory at Guadalete was not the end, it was the opening. Within a short span of time, key cities began to fall. Resistance fragmented. The rapid expansion that followed would have been unimaginable without that initial decisive rupture. Yet, we must resist the temptation to romanticize warfare. The deeper lesson here is not about swords or strategy alone. It is about preparation meeting opportunity. Tariq did not stumble into victory accidentally. He assessed conditions carefully. He understood that the enemy was politically divided. He moved strategically, and when confrontation came, he acted decisively. In our own lives, there are moments that function like Guadalete. They test whether we are internally aligned or internally conflicted. They expose whether our foundations are solid or merely decorative. And in those moments, outcomes are rarely determined by size, status, or appearance. They are determined by cohesion, clarity, and conviction. The Battle of Guadalete teaches us that decisive moments are not random. They are the result of long, building conditions. If you neglect internal unity, pressure will destroy you. But if you cultivate discipline and shared purpose, pressure can propel you forward. So, when your moment of confrontation arrives, and it will ask yourself, have I built unity within? Have I addressed the fractures? Because history reminds us of a simple truth. One decisive moment can reshape everything, but only for those prepared to meet it. Victory at the Battle of Guadalete was dramatic, but dramatic victories can be fragile. History is filled with examples of armies that win battles yet fail to build civilizations. Conquest can create a vacuum just as quickly as it creates opportunity, and this is where the next phase becomes critical. Because after Tariq ibn Ziyad's early successes, another figure entered the stage with a different kind of strength, the strength of consolidation and governance. That figure was Musa ibn Nusayr. Musa was not merely a military commander, he was an administrator. As governor of Ifriqiya under the Umayyad Caliphate, he understood that expansion without structure leads to chaos. When reports of Tariq's rapid victories reached him, he did not respond with jealousy alone, as some simplified narratives suggest. Rather, he recognized the need to ensure that momentum translated into stability, and this distinction is profound. It is one thing to win ground, it is another to govern it. When Musa crossed into Iberia with reinforcements, his objective was not simply to add to the tally of victories. He aimed to formalize control, organize territories, and integrate them into a broader administrative framework. Cities were not merely captured, they were structured. Agreements were negotiated. Local populations were given terms under Islamic governance, often allowing religious communities to maintain internal autonomy in exchange for political allegiance and taxation. This required discipline, it required long-term thinking, and perhaps most importantly, it required the subordination of ego to mission. There were tensions between Musa and Tariq. Historical sources suggest disagreements over authority and recognition. But even here, we learn something critical. Internal rivalry can destroy a project if left unchecked. Leadership maturity lies in preventing personal ambition from unraveling collective success. Musa's involvement ensured that the conquest did not dissolve into fragmented rule by independent warlords. Instead, Iberia began its transformation into what would later be known as Al-Andalus. Roads were secured. Administrative systems were put in place. Communication with Damascus was maintained. Without this phase of organization, the earlier victories might have faded into temporary incursions. Philosophically, this teaches us that momentum must be managed. After a break, through whether in history, in leadership, or even in personal growth, the real work begins. It is easy to be inspired at the beginning of a journey. It is far harder to institutionalize success. Many people experience their Guadalete a moment, a victory, an achievement, a breakthrough. But without structure, discipline, and systems, that victory becomes unsustainable. Musa represents the stage of maturity in any transformative project. He reminds us that passion must evolve into policy. And consider the broader strategic dimension. The Muslim forces did not attempt to erase every existing structure in Iberia overnight. Instead, they absorbed and adapted. They utilized local administrators when beneficial. They balanced firmness with pragmatism. This adaptability contributed significantly to the speed with which much of the peninsula came under control. Strength, therefore, was not expressed merely through force. It was expressed through governance. It is also worth noting that expansion requires accountability. Musa ultimately answered to the Umayyad Caliph in Damascus. Authority flowed upward, preventing complete decentralization. Systems survive when there are checks on power. Even conquerors require oversight. This phase of consolidation set the stage for centuries of civilization in Iberia. Without Musa's administrative intervention, the campaign might have remained a brief episode. With it, the foundation was laid for one of the most remarkable chapters of medieval history. And so the lesson deepens. Courage initiates change, decisive action secures opportunity, but sustainable impact demands organization, humility, and long-term vision. If you want your victories to last, whether in your personal life, your community, or your work, you must move beyond excitement and build systems. You must manage success as carefully as you pursued it. Because history shows us something undeniable. Winning a battle is impressive, but building stability is transformative. Once governance was established and authority consolidated, Iberia did not simply become another conquered province. It evolved into something far more significant, a civilization. This region, now known as Al-Andalus would grow into one of the most intellectually vibrant societies of the medieval world. And this transformation is critical to understand, because it shows us that the conquest of Spain was not merely a military episode, it was the beginning of a civilizational experiment. In the early decades, Al-Andalus remained under Umayyad authority from Damascus, but political shifts in the broader Muslim world would eventually reshape its destiny. When the Umayyad dynasty fell in the east, one surviving prince, Abd al-Rahman I fled across North Africa and established an independent Umayyad emirate in Cordoba in 756 CE. That moment marked the true institutional birth of a distinct Andalusian identity. Now reflect on this carefully. A territory initially taken through military means becomes, within a generation, a sanctuary for political refugees and a center of independent governance. That is not accidental. That is the result of foundations laid properly. Under Andalusian rule, cities like Cordoba flourished. Infrastructure expanded. Agricultural innovations were introduced. Trade networks connected Iberia with North Africa, the Middle East, and even parts of Europe. But beyond material growth, something more profound occurred. Intellectual cultivation. Libraries multiplied. Scholars engaged in theology, philosophy, medicine, mathematics, astronomy. Muslims, Christians, and Jews, though not living in some romantic utopia, as modern exaggerations sometimes suggest, nonetheless interacted within a framework that allowed exchange of knowledge. The concept of convivencia, coexistence, though complex and imperfect, reflected a social environment far more pluralistic than many parts of medieval Europe at the time. And here, we must pause to consider a deeper philosophical point. Military conquest can force submission, but it cannot produce admiration. Civilization earns admiration when knowledge thrives, when justice is perceived, when culture elevates, influence extends beyond borders. Al-Andalus became not just a political territory, but a beacon. European scholars would later travel to Muslim Spain to access classical works preserved and expanded upon by Muslim intellectuals. Translation movements in Toledo would help reintroduce Aristotle and other Greek thinkers into Western Europe. The ripple effects were enormous, but none of this would have happened if the conquest had remained purely militaristic. The sustainability of Al-Andalus lay in its ability to institutionalize learning, administration, and relative stability. And yet, even here, we must be realistic. Al-Andalus was not immune to internal strife. Later centuries would witness fragmentation into smaller Taifa kingdoms. Unity would weaken. External pressures from Christian kingdoms in the north would intensify. The same principle that explained the fall of the Visigothic kingdom applies universally. Internal division invites external challenge. So what then is the ultimate lesson of Al-Andalus? It teaches us that power is temporary unless anchored in values. It teaches us that conquest without cultivation is hollow. It teaches us that the highest form of victory is not territorial expansion, but intellectual and moral contribution. If you want to measure success, do not measure it by how much ground you take. Measure it by what you build upon that ground. Do you create systems of knowledge? Do you elevate standards of justice? Do you leave behind institutions that outlive you? Al-Andalus became a symbol not because it was conquered, but because it produced scholars, architecture, ideas, dialogue. Its legacy was written not only in battles, but in books. And that is the reflection I leave you with. The true measure of strength is not how powerfully you rise, but how meaningfully you build once you have risen. When we step back and look at the entire narrative, from the internal weakness of the Visigothic order, to the courage of Tariq, to the decisive moment at Guadalete, to the administrative strength of Musa, and finally to the flourishing of Al-Andalus, we realize something profound. This was never just a story about conquest. It was a story about patterns, and patterns repeat. History is not simply a sequence of events, it is a mirror of principles. The first lesson we saw was internal integrity. The Visigothic kingdom did not collapse because an army appeared at its shores. It collapsed because internal fractures made it vulnerable. Division at the top weakens resolve at the bottom. Corruption erodes loyalty. When justice is compromised, stability becomes fragile, and that principle transcends centuries. Whether we are speaking about nations, institutions, communities, or even our own spiritual state, decline begins internally. Before any external force overcomes you, there is usually an internal compromise that made it possible. Then we saw the power of decisive leadership. Tariq ibn Ziyad did not possess overwhelming numbers. What he possessed was clarity. He understood timing, he inspired conviction, he unified his ranks around purpose. Leadership, at its core, is about alignment, aligning people around a shared mission so that fear transforms into focus. But even decisive action is not enough. The Battle of Guadalete teaches us that turning points are prepared long before they arrive. Pressure does not create character, it reveals it. When the moment of testing comes, it exposes whether we have cultivated unity or allowed fragmentation to grow unchecked. And then comes perhaps the most mature lesson of all: sustainability. Musa ibn Nusayr represents the stage where vision must become structure. It is easy to be inspired by bold action. It is far harder to institutionalize success. Without systems, victories fade. Without governance, expansion collapses. Without discipline, momentum dissolves. Finally, Al-Andalus reminds us that the highest form of strength is contribution. Military triumph may open doors, but intellectual and moral excellence determine whether you leave a legacy. A civilization is not remembered for how loudly it conquered, but for how deeply it enriched humanity. Now, here is where the reflection becomes personal. Ask yourself, where are the fractures in your own life? Are there internal contradictions between belief and action, between ambition and discipline? Because if there are, external pressure will expose them sooner or later. Ask yourself, are you waiting for overwhelming resources before you act? Tariq did not wait. He moved when purpose aligned with opportunity. Ask yourself, if you achieve your breakthrough, do you have systems to sustain it? Or will success overwhelm you because you prepared only for the climb, not for the responsibility at the top? History is not meant to entertain us. It is meant to educate and warn us. The conquest of Spain teaches us that strength begins with inner reform, rises through courageous leadership, survives through disciplined structure, and endures through meaningful contribution. If we reduce this story to swords and battles, we miss its wisdom. But if we extract its principles, it becomes timeless guidance. And perhaps the most powerful takeaway is this: you do not need to conquer a land to apply these lessons. You need only conquer your weaknesses, unify your purpose, act with conviction, and build something that benefits others. Because in every generation, the real question is not who will cross the strait, it is who will repair the cracks within, step forward with clarity, and build a legacy that outlives them. History remembers those who align integrity with action. The question is, will you?